Hi, welcome back. In today's lesson, I'm going to talk briefly about the elements that compose living things and the molecules that they create. Well, I mean, the living things create the molecules out of these elements. Okay. And so the most important, or rather, the most prevalent element found in living things is carbon. So carbon is the backbone, the baseline of all of these molecules that make up our beautiful body. And the reason for that is carbon's shape, because as you may have heard me say before, shape determines function, right? So the shape of carbon lends itself really well to being the foundation for a bunch of different types of molecules. So carbon has 6 protons. A neutral carbon therefore has 6 electrons, 2 of which are living on the inside orbital, leaving 4 valence electrons. And so this carbon is trying to make 4 bonds with other molecules. This desire for 4 bonds creates a nice uniform structure. There's a lot of space between the elements that are going to bond to it, but it is also a pretty decent number of elements, right? So you can add a decent amount, 4, but those 4 elements have a lot of space to work. And so that's basically what makes carbon a really good foundation for building these larger molecules. The next most prevalent element that we find in living things is hydrogen, which is the smallest of all elements. Hydrogen's tininess lends itself well to being kind of a filler molecule, or rather filler element, right? And so whenever we have an empty space on one of these big molecules that we need to plug something into, we plug a hydrogen in, because it's only looking for one friend. So it's like a little end cap. You can end stuff. Okay? It's also pretty easy to remove in most cases, so if you want to change something out in that position. Okay? And then we have a lot of oxygen in these molecules. Right? Oxygen, the element, not oxygen, the gas. 2 different things, although oxygen, the gas, is of course composed of oxygen, the element. But anyways, so it's a little one oxygen by itself. Okay? The cool thing about oxygen is its electronegativity, which we heard about in the water lecture. Right? So those are the 3 main components of our biological macromolecules. Right? Then we have also a bunch of nitrogen. There's a lot of nitrogen in us. There's a fair amount of phosphorus, and there's a little bit of sulfur. Okay? So those are the components, the elements that build up all of our molecules that make us us. Okay? So all living things are composed of these elements. The 4 main categories of biological macromolecules, the things that build us, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. And so this is just a quick introduction. We will go into the details of each of these in a little bit more depth as we move forward, but for now I just want to show you the basic structure, composition, whatever you want to call it. Right? So carbohydrates, short chains and rings, composed entirely of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. CHO, 3 big ones. Right? So these ring structures, and you can link the ring structures up into longer chains, but that's the basics of carbohydrates. There's a generic formula for carbohydrates. It's CX, H2X, OX. Right? I could plug in a 3 here. It would be C3, H6O3. That's a generic carbohydrate formula. Okay? Tiny balls of CHO. Lipids also compose entirely of CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but these ones form much longer chains. Okay? And so even though they're composed of the same elements, we will see a difference in their function due to this difference in the composition of the same elements. There are also similarities in their functions due to the fact that they are made of the same stuff. And we'll explore that further. Then there are nucleic acids, things like DNA and RNA, also ATP, right? And they're made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. They have a generic monomer structure of having a phosphate group, a sugar ring, and then a variable nitrogenous base. There are 5 different nitrogenous bases that we'll talk about. And again, we'll get into that when the time comes. But yeah, that's a general structure, CHONP. And last, but certainly not least, the very sexy, the very wonderful, the very important protein. This group is one of the most interesting groups, I think. It's one of the most complex structures that we can form, of these protein structures, and they do all the stuff that our body needs to do. Right? And so like the other macromolecules have very important roles. We wouldn't exist without them, but proteins can do jobs that the other ones just can't. Right? Proteins can just do a whole myriad of different jobs, and they're really cool. Their generic structure is an amine group, a functional group, and then a carboxyl group. Okay? So this is called an amino acid. That's one monomer of a protein. You link a bunch of them together, you got a big, sexy protein. We'll get that. And they're made up of all the elements. There's C, H, O, and P, and then some of the amino acids have sulfur. Right? So that's where the sulfur shows up. It's pretty much the only time we see it. And yeah, that's it. Bye.